I've been on a lot of farms where nothing obvious was wrong. Same rates, same timing, same products that they've trusted for years, and yet the field just wasn't responding the way it used to. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that you could feel something had shifted if you'd paid attention. Yields would come in a little lighter than expected. Crops would look good early, then lose something as the season went on. You could walk those fields with the grower and there was always the same comment. It should have done better than this. And that's the part that stands out. Not failure, just underperformance that doesn't quite line up with what was done. And almost every time, the first instinct is the same. Push fertility a little harder. Maybe rates were a bit light. Maybe timing could be tightened up. Maybe a different product would get a better response. It's a logical place to go because that's the lever that's easiest to pull. But what I kept seeing over and over were that those adjustments weren't changing the outcome in a meaningful way. Rates would go up, but yield wouldn't follow. Programs would get more refined, more technology, more this or that, but consistencies wouldn't improve. It wasn't like things fell apart. It was just that the response stayed flat. When you see that pattern across enough fields, you start to recognize it. And you also start to realize that when something doesn't respond to the adjustments being made, it usually means the problem isn't what you're adjusting. What's interesting is how slowly this develops. It's not something that shows up in one single season. It builds over time. At first, it's easy to overlook. Just a part of the field that lags behind a little. One year doesn't respond quite like expected. One pass looks uneven, but there's no clear reason why. That's normal variability until it isn't. Because then it keeps showing up. Same areas, same kind of response. Inputs change, but the pattern doesn't. And eventually the conversation shifts into something that I hear quite often. We're putting more in, but we're not getting more out. At that point, most of the usual explanations get tested. The weather reports get looked at, variety gets questioned, timing, equipment, all of it gets reviewed. But one thing that often isn't examined closely, at least not in a functional sense, is the soil itself. It's looked at in terms of numbers, but not in terms of behavior. And that's really where the disconnect starts, because there's an underlying assumption built into modern fertility programs. If nutrients are applied, the crop will take them up. And for a period of time, that assumption holds true. But what I've seen is that it only works for as long as that soil system supporting it is functioning properly. Fertilizer doesn't move directly into the plant. It moves through the soil. And if that soil starts to lose its ability to process, to hold, and deliver nutrients efficiently, then everything being done on the surface becomes less reliable, even if it still looks correct on paper. And this is a very important point. Most of the time, this doesn't show up as a clear single issue. It shows up as a series of inconsistencies that don't quite add up. In some parts of the field, nutrients don't seem to last as long as they should. Nitrogen carries the crop early, then fades sooner than expected. Sulfur deficiencies start appearing more frequently, even when it's being applied. Tissue tests don't always align with application rates. The natural response is to assume supply is the issue, so rates are increased. But when the pattern doesn't change, it raises a different question. Not how much is being applied, but why is the soil not retaining it? In other areas, the opposite situation shows up. Soil tests indicate that nutrients are present, sometimes even at high levels, but the crop still expresses deficiency. That creates a different kind of frustration because now the question becomes, if it's there, why isn't the plant using it? When you start looking closely at these areas, they often share certain characteristics. They may stay wetter longer. They may seal over after rainfall. You get that really nasty crust. Structure may be different. Oxygen movement may be limited. The nutrients haven't disappeared, but the environment that they are in has changed in a way that affects availability. At that point, it becomes clear that this isn't strictly a supply issue, it's a function issue. So one of the most consistent indicators of that is what is happening below ground. When root systems are examined across different parts of the same field, the differences can be significant. In areas that are performing well, roots tend to move deeper, spread more fully, and occupy a larger volume of soil. In weaker areas, they often don't. They remain shallower, less dense, and more restricted. I've even seen them turn all the way around and come back to the surface looking for nutrients. This alone explains more than most people expect, because even if nutrients are present, the plant still has to have the ability to physically access them. If the root system isn't exploring the soil effectively, then large portions of the available nutrition are simply out of reach. But there's another layer beyond that, and it's one that is less visible. There are situations where the nutrients are present and roots are present, and yet the crop still doesn't perform the way it should. That's where the efficiency of uptake itself comes into question. What I've observed is that the soil environment plays a direct role in how effectively plants can absorb nutrients. Factors like oxygen availability, biological activity, and overall soil structure influence not just whether nutrients are there, but whether they can actually be taken in and used effectively by the plant. When those conditions are off, uptake efficiency drops way down, and it's tested by drought. And then we just say, well, it needs to rain. Well, there's a lot of things that led to this. And yes, we need water, but that's just more of the same symptom. When this happens, the plants behave as though it's deficient, even when the nutrients are technically available. When I start looking at all of these pieces together, a pattern emerges. Nutrients aren't being retained the way that they should. Some of what is retained becomes unavailable. Root systems are more limited. Uptake efficiency is reduced. Each of those has its own impact, but together they create a situation where increasing inputs produces diminishing returns, and that's not what we want to hear, is it? That's the flattening response curve that many growers have experienced. Early on, when soil function is strong, fertility drives clear results. Adjustments produce measurable gains. That's what we want to see. But over time, these gains become smaller and smaller. More input is required to achieve the same output, and eventually, additional input stops producing a meaningful response altogether. That isn't random, and it isn't just an economic issue. It's a signal that the underlying system is no longer supporting the approach that is being used. What I often see is that efforts to correct this stay focused at the input level, or they go with a different fertilizer provider. Rates are adjusted, products are changed, timing is refined. Those are all valid tools, but they don't address a system level limitation, because the issue isn't what is being applied, it's the condition of the soil that is receiving it. The challenge is this kind of problem doesn't present itself clearly. The crop doesn't fail outright. It simply doesn't reach its expected potential. The language around it usually is the same. It should have done better. It looked good early and then something held it back. Conditions were there, but the yield didn't follow. That gap between expectation and outcome is where the issue shows up. Here's something interesting. This is one of the only places in our lives that if we lose something, we just go, well, it's lost. That's what we say about fertility. Oh, it's just lost. Well, maybe we should find it. The shift happens when attention moves away from what's being added and toward what the soil is actually doing. That's when patterns start to become more visible. Areas that hold water longer than expected, surfaces that seal or crust over, uneven emergences that repeat across seasons, differences in root development that align with performance. Those aren't just random variations, they're indicators of how the soil system is functioning in different parts of the field. Once you start looking at it that way, it becomes clear that high-performing areas aren't just responding to inputs, they're operating under better conditions. Lower performing areas aren't simply lacking something. They're constrained by how the soil is functioning. Let's focus on the word constrained. At that point, fertilizer starts to look different. It's no longer the primary driver. It's dependent on the system all around it. When soil function is strong, fertility works the way it's expected to. Nutrients cycle, roots explore, uptake is efficient, and the crop responds. That's what we want. When soil function is compromised, those same inputs produce very different results. And that's why increasing inputs doesn't always solve the problem. Not because the inputs are wrong, but because the system they depend on isn't supporting them. So the focus begins to shift. Instead of asking how to push the crop harder, the question becomes how to restore the soil's ability to function. Because until that's addressed, every single other adjustment is working against a limitation that hasn't been resolved. Does that make sense? From that perspective, fertilizer hasn't really stopped working. What's changed is the soil system that it relies on. It's no longer holding, cycling, and delivering nutrients the way it once did. And until that changes, results will continue to be inconsistent, no matter on how well the program is designed on the surface, no matter how much technology you involve. It's almost like we're leading back to where we grab that soil and we smell it and we feel it and we get into it. That leads to a deeper question, one that sits underneath all of this. What actually determines whether the soil is functioning properly? What controls whether nutrients move, become available, and are ultimately taken up by the plant? Because it's not just about how much is present. What I've come to see is that the real issue isn't that fertilizer stopped working. It is that the soil stopped responding the way it used to. And once that shift happens, everything built on top of it becomes less predictable. Until that underlying function is restored, you're not really working with the system, you're working against it.